Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party candidate and the Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to educate and advocate for the eco-socialist platform that Angela Walker and I ran on. So I'm going to give you 4 reasons today why we need the Green Party based on what's going on in the news. Yesterday, a Texas court invalidated the FDA's 23-year-old approval of Medicaid abortion, the pill mifepristone. And an hour later, a Washington court reaffirmed the FDA's approval. So this is likely headed to the Supreme Court, where the conservative Republican majority is likely to rule against medication abortion, like they overturned Roe v. Wade. So anyone who says there's no difference between the Democrats and Republicans is not paying attention. The Democrats don't have solutions for climate, poverty, militarism, but they are different than the Republicans on abortion and some other issues, which has an enormous impact on women's freedom. Yet you look at the Democrats' performance on the issue, and we can't count on them to protect abortion rights. You know, they had their chance when they had the majority in both houses of Congress under the Obama administration and under the Biden administration in the first sessions of both of those presidents. And they failed to pass the Women's Health Protection Act, which would have codified Roe v. Wade. The reason it failed was they failed to challenge and overturn the filibuster in the Senate. So that's why we need the Green Party. Even on where the Democrats are different than the Republicans, we can't count on them to follow through on their stated position. And then the day before yesterday, we had the expulsion of 2 Black Democrats from the Tennessee state legislature because they spoke from the legislative floor in support of student protesters in the gallery who were demanding gun safety legislation after that Memphis school mass shooting. And so for doing that, you know, speaking up on behalf of the people in the gallery and their constituents, the Republican supermajority in that legislature expelled them from their legislative seats. So again, the Democrats and the Republicans are not the same. And this is, you know, another instance of, you know, the real danger of authoritarian Republicans assaulting democracy. Yet on this question, the Democrats failed again. They failed to pass laws in the last session of Congress when they had a majority in both houses for voting rights and election protection. And again, it was a filibuster that they wouldn't overturn. And they had the votes to do that if they had wanted to. In that case, the rule could have been changed by 51 votes. So if all 50 Democrats in the Senate plus the vice president, Kamala Harris, had voted to overturn the filibuster, they could have passed, you know, the Women's Health Protection Act and the voting rights and election protection bills. And instead, we're now in a position where they can't get passed because the Republicans have a majority in the House. It's a narrow majority, but it's enough. And again, that shows why we need the Green Party to get into office and get these things through, which are not even radical reforms. They are basic rights that have overwhelming support among the people in this country. And the third example is the extreme right-wing Israeli government provoking violence in their conflict with the Palestinians. It so happens this weekend we have a convergence of Ramadan, Passover, and Easter. It's a holy time, and we have holy sites for all of those 3 Abrahamic religions in the old city in Israeli-occupied East Jerusalem. The Al-Aqsa Mosque for Muslims, where Muhammad is believed to have descended to heaven. The Wailing Wall for Jews, which is the last remaining structure of the Temple Mount, the Jewish temple on the same site before the Muslims took over the site in the year 690 and built the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And then not far away are several Christian holy sites in the old city of Jerusalem, where Jesus is believed to have been resurrected. So this is a sensitive time. And what we've had this week is the Israeli military raiding and arresting hundreds of worshipers in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And of course, there was a response from Palestinians based in Lebanon and Gaza, and the Israelis responded with their rocket assaults. And meanwhile, we're having gun battles between Israelis and Palestinians on the West Bank. And this was totally unnecessary. The Israeli provocations at the Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan follows on months of attacks on the West Bank Palestinians by the Israeli military and settlers. And so it's way past time to impose BDS sanctions on Israel for its violation of Palestinian human rights and land. And now this provocation that could create a lot of violence. Excuse me. No. How do I turn this off? I'm turning it off. Some guy in Alaska wants to talk to me. Sorry about that. Whoop. So I was saying it's time for sanctions against Israel. Like we put sanctions on apartheid South Africa. Boycott, divestment sanctions. There's a National Palestinian BDS committee. And what they're asking is the first sanction is to cut off military aid to Israel. And we should do that until Israel starts recognizing the human rights and the land of Palestinians. Right now, basically, the U.S. has given the Israeli government, which is now the most extreme right-wing government they've ever had, a blank check. And again, this is something, BDS is something almost every Democrat and all the Republicans oppose, but the Green Party is for. So that's another reason we need the Green Party. And then in the background of all this is the climate crisis. And I just would point out that the International Panel on Climate Change models show that global greenhouse gas emissions have to peak before 2025 and then decline by 43% from 2019 levels by 2030. If we're going to have just a 40% chance of holding the warming of the planet to 1.5 degrees Celsius without overshooting that. And that is the standard that was chosen at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015. Here we are 8 years later. And it's not happening. I mean, it isn't going to happen without a global eco-socialist revolution, because it's not just the United States where this is going to change, it's all over the world. And even if we did meet that standard of peaking emissions in 2025 and reducing them by 43% by 2030, that 40% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius is not good odds. So I think what we got to face is that 1.5 degree target, which was the lowest plausible target in 2015, is not going to be met. I mean, Greenpeace International and others were calling for a 1 degree target back in the mid 1990s. But of course, that didn't get any traction. It wasn't until there was a real strong push by particularly the Global South and the island nations in 2015 that we got the target at least named. So what all this means is that we're going to overshoot 1.5 degrees. So the question now is, can we move to zero and then negative greenhouse gas emissions as fast as possible to limit the overshoot of the 1.5 degree target and start to bring global temperatures back to the safety zone, which, when we looked at it, when the climate action movement looked at it, 1 degree has caused problems. We've already seen that, but get below that and we begin to get back into the safety zone. So we got to keep pushing for a eco-socialist and global Green New Deal. And here again, we cannot count on the Democrats, let alone the Republicans. Biden announced a goal of 52% reductions by 2030. And why 52 and not 50? I think he just pulled that number out his back end. But there's no way that's going to happen. I mean, even with the Inflation Reduction Act, which has some climate actions, but also a lot of pro-fossil fuel policies, it's not going to happen. As I've been calling it, that was Inflation Reduction Act was the Build Back Badly Act. And then, in recent weeks, we've seen the approval of the Willow project for oil drilling in Alaska and the auctioning off of oil and gas drilling sites in the Gulf of Mexico in an area the size of Italy. So we're going in the wrong direction under Democratic leadership. And just to add to that, here in New York, we just had a big fight, and it's ongoing with the Democratic governor, Kathy Hochul, who's been trying to gut New York's already 2-week climate program. I said 2 week. Week as in W-E-A-K, not 2 weeks. She's tried to weaken the carbon reduction goals in that bill, which are only 40% by 2030. It's not even what Biden is claiming. Rejecting including methane emissions in the state's greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals. And by opposing a carbon tax and posing the alternative of a cap and trade system with low carbon prices and less revenues for renewable energy investments than the carbon tax that some of us have been advocating would raise. The state itself estimates it needs $10 billion a year to implement its modest greenhouse gas reduction and clean energy program. Of course, the Greens, and when I ran for governor and our other activities, we have proposed a much larger investment, more on the order of $25 billion a year. I was calling for that in 2010. And we had good data to show that was needed in our case, because we wanted a 10-year plan to get to zero emissions. But Hochul is refusing to tax the rich or use a carbon tax to raise those funds. Now, we were able to beat back. The state budget is due. It's overdue now. It's supposed to be done on April 1st. And we were able to get her proposals out of the budget. But that doesn't mean she's not going to bring them back in the rest of the session, which will do legislation. And that ends in June. So the fight continues. But again, it's a common theme here. We can't count on the Democrats, even though they're not as bad as the Republicans. We need to elect Greens to office. So let's get to your questions and your comments. Scout Trooper 164. Did you hear about French protesters storming the Blackstone headquarters? I didn't hear about that particular, BlackRock's headquarters. Okay. Didn't hear about that particular action, but I know that this is really massive protests, and it's not just in Paris and cities all over France. And I posted, I think I put it on my Twitter, a link to an article by a long-time leftist in Greece who was saying that this is more radical than even the May-June events in 1968. And what's different this time is that the unions and the major left parties are not dismissing the feminist and ecological demands. And there's a lot of ecological and environmental demands being raised at the same time in France. So all these movements are coming together with a more social and ecological program. And, when he wrote that, they were going to have that vote of no confidence in Macron, and he barely survived that. But this is something to keep an eye on because, the upsurge from below is changing French politics. And even before this, in the last French elections, the Greens and the left, but the Greens in particular, made enormous gains and won mayorships in many cities and got more people into the legislatures at both the provincial and national level. And they're in alliance with the socialists and the communists and the far left group called, it's a French word, but anyway, there's a fourth far left party. And they have worked together. Now, coalitions are difficult, and at this point, they all say they're going to run their own candidate in the next presidential election. And I guess they're all hoping they can get to the second round because they have runoff elections there if you don't get a majority, and nobody's going to get a majority. In any case, while I didn't hear about this one action. I know that what's going on in France is important and it's radical, and we should keep an eye on it. Frankie Lee, Howie, why can't people here get angry enough to protest like they're doing now in France? Well, for one thing, they have left parties and trade unions that are not such business unions where they're hobnobbing with the bosses more than they're representing their workers. So right away, they got an institutional base. Another difference is France is a smaller country, and we are a big geographically and diverse culturally country. So it's harder to get a consensus. And there you converge on France and on Paris, and the government is paralyzed, and people can get to Paris, but they can also, as they're doing now, do parallel demonstrations in the cities. It's just more difficult in the United States given our scale. But I think the thing we're missing most, we can get over the geography if we can build the left parties and reform the trade union movement so that it is actually out there organizing people. We are down to a record low. I think it's below 6% of the private sector, about 11% of all workers, including the public sector. I mean, that's less than we had organized in the 1920s, before the union movement got going in the 30s. So, those are things that we need to take care of. And by the way, on April 29th, which is close to May Day, we're going to have as guests Bill Berry, who's a longtime union organizer, a Green in Baltimore, and Natalie Monarez, who is one of the organizers of the Amazon Labor Union in Staten Island. And they're going to be talking about labor organizing. And we'll have more information on that. But that's on April 29th. And we're going to be talking about how to get the labor movement going and organized more like what they got in France. So I think, that's it. We need an organized left and labor movement. And it's the biggest thing we can do to get to a situation where we can respond to what the government's doing like they are in France. Scout Trooper 164. What do you think of the Iran war plan leak? I personally feel that it's doctored and it's distracting from domestic issues in office. Well, the leak appeared on social media, and it looks like Russian hackers got it. And so these documents are out there. One of them, even anybody with any familiarity with Photoshop can see it's doctored. And that is a chart that changed the estimates of casualties on the Ukrainian and Russian sides, and basically radically raised the Ukrainian casualties and lowered the Russian casualties, which, so then, people in Russia are saying, maybe this is a leak to this, divert us from what's really going on. The Ukrainians say it doesn't matter. These leaks are from documents that are over a month old, and they don't really say what we're going to do. One of the interesting things that came out is we know that the U.S. intelligence services are spying on the Ukrainians. They admit that they know more about what the Russians are planning than what the Ukrainians are planning. We're also spying on allies in NATO, which is nothing new either. I mean, under the Obama administration, it came out that they were listening in on the calls of the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, and she wasn't happy about it. So a lot of interesting things to think about there, but I don't think it's to distract from domestic issues, because, it's unless you're saying the Russians are doing it to distract from their domestic issues. There are Russian socialists who say that one of the reasons for Putin's war in Ukraine is to distract from domestic problems, because their welfare state, they can't afford it. inequality is greater than it is even in the United States. They got a lot of problems, and right now they've got this white Christian nationalist rhetoric coming on state media, and one of the responses in one of the Asian areas was to burn down a Russian Orthodox church in retaliation for that racist stuff that's coming off Russian state media from the Russian chauvinists. So, there are a lot of domestic problems in Russia. Of course, we have them too, but I don't think this leak from the U.S. side was related to our domestic issues. I think, it looks like the Russians hacked this and are releasing it to social media. So, it makes for a lot of speculation, but I don't think it's going to make much difference with Ukraine's coming counteroffensive, or what Russia is doing, which looks like a petering out winter offensive, and now they're just trying to hold on, expecting the Ukrainian offensive. So the war plans are they're old, over a month old. So I'm not sure either side gets much out of it. And as some of the Russians are saying, they let us capture this stuff so it get leaked and confuse us. So who knows? I think what really counts is what happens on the ground. Via email, response to U.S. politicians meeting with Taiwan's leader as she passed through the U.S. in a Chinese response. Yeah, I think both sides are going through histrionics. I don't know why a pro-democracy politician from Taiwan would want to meet with Republican leadership. Apparently, the Democratic leadership wouldn't meet with her here because it's provocative to China. And then Chinese response is overblown, with all these military exercises in the strait between mainland China and Taiwan. So I just hope, and I think cooler heads will prevail, and this will be a lot of posturing and messaging, but it's not going to come to blows. I think, the U.S. policy since Nixon has been to recognize that Taiwan is part of China, but it doesn't say, one state, two systems like the Hong Kong agreement did. So the U.S. has been ambivalent about whether they would defend Taiwan if mainland China tried to take it over by force, and probably should stay the same way. And Taiwan has the right to get arms to defend itself. But I think what the U.S. should be encouraging is, keep the status quo of peace, build the economic ties, and let's not start a war over this. Let's resolve this over time diplomatically. Vicky Corden, I'm concerned about different states moving the fascist way. Example, Tennessee, Texas, Florida. Fascism is taking over state by state. Yes, that's true. Where the Republicans have control of both houses and the governorship, they are enacting, laws that are authoritarian, at least. We can argue over how you want to define fascism, but they're certainly authoritarian and repressive of the vote, of abortion rights, of counting the vote fairly, fair elections. And this is all anti-democratic, and it's a real danger. And I'm getting tired of hearing people on the left say, oh, the Democrats are as bad as the Republicans, and even the neoliberal Democrats are worse than the neo-fascist Republicans. It's not true. There are differences, as I talked about in the opening. And, we should recognize that. And in some cases, to fight for abortion rights, to fight for voting rights, we should ally with those Democrats who are fighting for them. I'm not talking about in elections. I'm talking about between elections in terms of lobbying and speaking out. In elections, I still think we should run against the Democrats because they don't have real solutions to these life or death issues of climate, poverty, and war that we're facing. But it's definitely true that we got serious problems in some of the states. And this is a long festering problem in the United States. The Dixiecrats, who were Democrats, came to power on the slogan of white supremacy in the former Confederacy, and the Democrats were in coalition with them. The Northern machines, that represented more of the ethnic, different ethnic groups in the working class. It was a politically perverse coalition. Again, that's what enabled that was the lack of a multi-party system based on proportional representation. So the left could form its own alternative and appeal. And in the South, for example, the black vote in the South is probably the most social democratic vote, or the black vote in this country is probably the most social democratic vote in this country. So on economic class issues, there's a basis for certainly a strong third party, if not majoritarian support for those issues. The social issues, are more complicated. African Americans certainly want racial justice, but they're divided on, gay rights and abortion to some extent, based on some of the churches and their positions in that community. But what we need is a labor-based third party that's progressive on the social issues, and I think that's where most Americans are. If you look at polling over the last basically 100 years that we've had polling, it really got going in the 30s. The country's moved to the left on both economic class issues and social issues. So things are moving our direction. The problem with our political system is that public opinion can't get translated into public policy because we don't have our own party. The progressives get lost in the sauce of the Democratic Party, which is run by the corporate leadership. So, the best way to, it's one thing, the Greens can actually fight the fascists. The Democrats try to accommodate them. That's Biden's continuing to this day appeal for bipartisanship with the party that tried to overthrow his election. I mean, what kind of politics is that? We have to defeat fascism, not accommodate it. So I also am concerned, Vicki. It's a problem we got to face, and we got to defeat them, not just find a way to work across the aisle with them, because they are not, they're against what enables us to have, agree to disagree and still develop public policy, and that is democracy. And Republicans aren't interested in that. They want to rule, and they'll do it if they have to steal elections, deny people the right to vote, and so forth. So, we really got to defeat them, not just try to work with them. Elliot Saturn. Nah, the only difference between Democrats and Republicans is Republicans will do something horrible and tell you to your face that they're doing it, while the Republicans will do the same, but say they're doing the opposite, even on abortion. Democrats oppose abortion rights, but pretend to support them. I think that's going too far, Elliot. The Democrats, I think personally they support it. It's just they're not willing to fight for it. That what got the Women's Health Protection Act passed in the House, had majority support, at least a 51 vote support, and probably one or two others. Lisa Murkowski and that senator from Maine, whose name's skipping my mind. Good chance they would have voted for it, but it wasn't enough to get 60 to override the filibuster. So, but I think you're also saying something that the Republicans will tell you they're going to do what they're going to do, and they do it. Whereas the Republicans are often talking out of both sides of their mouth, particularly when it comes to issues like corporate crime and progressive taxation. I mean, just take that one. The Democrats never did repeal the Trump tax cuts, and before that, the Bush tax cuts. And that's why our overall tax system is basically a flat tax. When you add in local, state, and federal taxes, poor people and right up to the very richest pay the same basic rate. And then you get to the, super rich, and then their rate goes down because they have so many ways of investing and claiming losses and things like that reduces their overall tax rate. So I think, we just can't say that Democrats are the same as the Republicans, but we're hypocritical. I think it's more than that. And, you got to know your enemies. And the Republicans, they do want to get rid of abortion rights. They do want to limit the right to vote. They do want to be able to steal elections, quote unquote, legally. And the Democrats, have been resisting that, but not strong enough to get the end result we want. So that's why I'm saying we need the Greens, because we will fight the fascists, not try to work with them across the aisle, so to speak. Gordon Howard, the wealthy are destroying planet Earth just to make money. Where are they going to live? Well, some of them think they're going to live in their gated communities and secure compounds. And, to a certain extent, if they can, concentrate the wealth and resources in their hands, even as the rest of us are, living in a terrible world and scrambling to survive, they will be, behind armed guards, doing all right. That's the way they're looking at it. Of course, what kind of world is that to, leave to your children? It just shows how callous a lot of these very rich people are. It's just unbelievable. I think Elon Musk kind of epitomizes that these days. His, his callousness toward people who are struggling is just immoral. Via email, Illinois is moving to end its moratorium on new nuclear power plants. Comments. Yeah, we got insanity, nuclear madness going on. We're subsidizing nuclear power plants in New York and Ohio and California that are way past their planned lifetime and are becoming more susceptible to serious accidents. Just the radiation embrittles a lot of the metal parts and they become weaker. And then if you want to go to clean energy, now nuclear isn't carbon free. There's a lot of carbon spent in the uranium fuel cycle in building the nuclear power plants and in backing them up. When they're shut down, they rely on diesel generators to keep cooling the plant. So, or in emergencies where they're shut down. So it's not carbon free, but it's certainly less carbon than just straight up burning coal, oil, and gas. But it's so expensive for that same investment in building a nuclear power plant, which tends to be 10, 20 billion, up to 30 billion these days. You can build a lot more solar and wind installations that generate more power than a nuclear power plant will. So, Illinois, it's the industry and the influence of that industry on legislators. And, that's a problem we got with all these big businesses. They spend enormous amounts on lobbying and on candidates' campaigns. And so those politicians answer to their donors and not their voters. Illinois has got to fight back against that. It's an enormous waste of money. And that money should be invested in solar and wind and efficiency and batteries and other forms of storing power that's generated by solar and wind. So it can be put back into the grid when it's needed. No nukes. Illinois is bailing out the industry to the tune of billions. Our much touted climate bill, quote unquote, CEJA, spent twice as much bailing out nuclear as it did on renewables. Yeah, and Illinois legislature, I'm curious as to where the Democrats and Republicans came out on that climate bill. Was there dissent from some of the Democrats on this policy, or were they aligned with it along with the Republicans? Or did the Republicans not want to do anything on climate and vote against it? I don't know. I'm curious because a lot of times these, both the Democrats and Republicans, the leadership has an all of the above energy policy. That means fossil fuels, nuclear, as well as solar and wind. And that was the policy of the Obama administration, and it continues. They consider it the most progressive climate bill in the country. The Dems are upholding it as a national model. Yeah, well, it's not if it's subsidizing nuclear power. And yeah, New York says it has the most progressive bill. Hawaii says that. California says that. It's just politician rhetoric. You got to look at what's concretely in it. And I haven't looked at the details of Illinois, so I couldn't, rank it in terms of its progressivity. But if it's supporting nuclear power, it's not a progressive bill. It's diverting enormous resources away from renewables. Scout Trooper 164. I think we need to realize that's the trick the politicians in office play. They use keywords for bills to make people think the bills help the people when they do anything but. Yeah, the names for some of these bills really don't correspond to what's in the bill. That's for sure. That's the old trick that the politicians play, no doubt. BD Dimmitt. Ukraine has a surrender hotline that is noted as bringing them material along with Russians who don't want to be fighting. News is that Russian tanks and armored troop carriers and the like are being put back into the field in the hands of the Ukrainians. How likely is it that the Russians will smuggle bombs or some other means of doing harm remotely into Ukrainian hands to be set off later? Um, well, I would hope, and I think the Ukrainians account for that when the Russians cross the line and say we surrender. Here's a tank or armored troop carrier. They pat down the people, and then they inspect the tanks and armored troop carriers carefully, so they make sure they're not booby trapped. The hotline, is yeah, I've seen that advertised a lot, and they do get a lot of calls from Russian conscripts that don't want to be fighting against Ukraine in that invasion. So I don't have numbers. It's difficult to cross an active battle line. And in fact, on the Russian side, like the prisoners that the Wagner group put in the front lines on these human assault waves and Bakhmut and other places. If they turn around, there are regular Russian troops that'll shoot them for turning around. So they're really in a hard spot if they're trying to get out. But the hotline, apparently it is getting Russian troops to surrender and come to safety on the Ukrainian side. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of Putin's quote unquote dire warning after Finland joined NATO? Yeah, he's getting to be like the little boy that cried wolf. Every time something happens he doesn't like, he, rattles his nuclear sabers. And, one thing he did was to say he's bringing tactical nukes into Belarus. And I think the US and NATO are right not to change the nuclear posture and policy of the Western states that have nukes, and not, not get on this escalatory ladder with Putin. So, earlier Putin said, I don't care if Finland and Sweden join NATO. That was last spring. So he's not been consistent in his messaging either. The thing is, Finland is no joke as a military. They got twice as many tanks and fighter jets as the UK does. And the last time Russia, then the Soviet Union, invaded Finland as part of a deal Stalin cut with Hitler when they divided Poland between them, and then Russia attacked Finland, and they got beat. They got defeated. They had to retreat. They did end up taking some of Finland's land, which is now the Finns have left it and the Russians have settled it. So they did get a little bit of Finland's land, but Finland was no joke back in World War I. That was a war what they call it, the Winter War, I think, in 1939, 1940. The Finns beat back the Russians, and now they've got a formidable military. So, Putin said that, he was going to war against Ukraine because NATO was encroaching on Russia. The last state to join NATO on Russia's border was in 2004. And there was no way Ukraine was going to be brought into NATO. In fact, this week, reporting that, the US and Germany still don't want to give a membership action plan, which is the steps that would bring Ukraine into NATO. It just wasn't happening and isn't going to happen, at least until this war is over, and then they'll maybe look at it again. So Putin said, he was trying to stop NATO. His invasion united NATO more than it's been united in decades, and got Finland and Sweden to say, we better join NATO because we're afraid of Russian aggression. So Putin is, if he really did want to weaken NATO, he got the opposite. And so there's a lot of talk. Putin is the least worst of them. I mean, Medvedev is, I just saw a post he put on, I guess on Twitter. I think it was on Twitter, and he's calling the Ukrainians racist things, and the Poles are called Polacks. I mean, he was insulting everybody he could, and I don't know what their point is, because the Russian military is not doing that well in Ukraine, and so all this talk, I think it's like the little boy that cried wolf. At some point, if the wolf really does show up, nobody's going to believe it. But Putin doesn't have a wolf that can bite. He does have the nukes, but to use them would be suicidal. So I don't think he's going to do it. So anyway, I think Putin's just huffing and puffing, woofing, as we say. But I don't think he's going to do anything. Scout Trooper 164. I've been hearing that Ukraine's counteroffensive is using modern equipment and waiting for the snow to clear, while the Russians are running out of modern tech and using stuff from the 60s. True? That's what the reporting says. That's what, the major news organizations, the military bloggers, the pro-Russian, far right, let's nuke Ukraine military bloggers in Russia are saying. Igor Sirkin, who was, instrumental in forcing the Crimean legislature at gunpoint to vote for a independence referendum in 2014, and then the next month was in the Donbass, and he said, if his military hadn't been there, there wouldn't have been a military rebellion. That guy, he is, acknowledging that, the Russians aren't producing enough material to keep the fight up at the rate they're using it, and they're weak. And he said, the Russians have already lost in Ukraine. The one thing I just add to qualify all I just said is that what happens in wars is very unpredictable. And, I'm not making a prediction as to what's going to happen with the counteroffensive. The snow is clearing. There's a warmed up this week. It's the mud. And it's going to take another month or so for that mud to clear up before the ground is in a condition where an offensive with heavy armor, armored troop carriers and tanks can make, fast progress. So we'll have to see what happens. Frankie Lee, how can we keep the Restrict Act from passing? This doesn't involve TikTok, but makes us able to be surveilled at all times. Yeah, I saw a headline about the Restrict Act, and I didn't read the story. And I'm not sure what's in it, but I think we do have to be concerned. This is a general principle that how they regulate these social media platforms should protect us from surveillance. And I keep pointing out that the European Union has laws that make our online information our property, not the property of the social media platforms that collected it. And we have a right to uh, restrict them from using it for commercial purposes or surveillance purposes. So, I'll have to look at that Restrict Act and see what's, in it. But I think, we do need to keep our own surveillance on what, Congress does to regulate the social media platforms. Lee Showron, what do you think will happen since Trump got indicted? Well, Trump's going to be in the headlines. There are more indictments coming. In the case of the payoffs to the porn stars, or the porn star and the playmate, that case isn't even going to trial till next December, just as the Republican primaries heat up. But there are other indictments in the pike or the pipeline. The case of election interference in Georgia, and then the Department of Justice investigations into mishandling classified documents and inciting insurrection on January 6th. So a lot more indictments are going to drop. The problem is this takes so long through the courts. And, what really irritates me is it took the Department of Justice so long to get moving. They finally appointed a special prosecutor instead of doing it themselves. And this is now in the third year after that January 6th event. Meanwhile, they've been able to indict and convict hundreds of the people that actually went into the Capitol, but the people that planned it, and it's not just Trump. We, from reporting, we know it was people like Steve Bannon and the dirty trickster. Forgetting his name right now. I run into him at gubernatorial debates. I'm forgetting his name. Roger Stone, and Trump's son. Other members of the administration, the chief of staff, Mark Meadows. I mean, a lot of these people were involved in planning. Michael Flynn, those clown lawyers that were saying Trump could, had the right to get Pence to, stop the certification of the election in the Senate. A lot of people, and here they are 2 years later, and most of them walking free, none indicted yet. So I guess what's on my mind is what the hell is taking them so long? I know lawyers got to line up the evidence and all that, but I'm getting impatient. I see Amy Sachs says in the chat, maybe now Trump will support the rights of convicted felons to vote. Yeah, that would be interesting. Yeah, I guess he'd have a different point of view than he does now as a felon who never got convicted. So, yeah, by the way, I think, nobody should lose their right to vote. In fact, having the right to vote and participate in the civic life of your country is part of rehabilitation, because a lot of people who are involved in street crime in particular are alienated from their communities, and they don't feel bad about stealing or whatever it is they did. So that's part of the rehabilitation process as far as I'm concerned. Plus, they have human rights and concerns that public policy affects. They should have the right to vote. Marsha Everett, mandatory voting. Ralph Nader's big on that. They do it in many states, Australia, for example. And if you don't vote, you get a modest fine. I think it's like $25 in Australia. Along with that becomes mandatory voter registration. In other words, it's the obligation of the state to make sure everybody who's eligible is registered to vote, instead of it on the backs of the voters who, as regular people, we're busy, we're dealing with things, and election comes up and we may have moved or, or a lot of people think if they didn't register for this election, they're not registered anymore. There's a lot of confusion. So I think I personally am for mandatory voting. My campaign in 2020, nobody else was, so I didn't really campaign on it. But um, I think it would be a good idea. We get more people voting, and if we have bigger votes, the politics of the country will move to the left because it's mostly lower income, working class, people of color, young people who vote in a lower proportion. And if they were getting a $25 fine, if they didn't vote, more of them would go out and vote, and it would change what the outcomes were of those elections. Scout Trooper 164, Howie, how do you think the mainstream media perpetuates mass shootings? I'm asking because Breaking Points made a video on this topic. Um, well, I think they do get a lot of media coverage. And if a motivation for a mass shooter is to get their 15 minutes of fame, then, media coverage would uh, motivate them to do a mass shooting. Um, some of the media has decided they won't say who the mass shooter was in order to take away that motivation. Although most people want to know who it was, and it comes out. I think the mass shootings question is partly a question of gun safety laws, but more a question of changing our culture. We're in a dynamic where people that are uh, alienated and resentful for various reasons, many of which are not legitimate. Uh, they sort of take their vengeance out with a mass shooting, and so it's kind of there's a copycat formula there, and to get out of it, it's going to be difficult. I'm not sure there's a magic bullet. I think if we had better gun safety legislation, so there were less shootings. Period. Remember, most people killed by shootings are not in mass shootings. They're in, murders that come out of crimes of passion or street gang feuds. So there's a lot we need to do in that area. And part of it is education and cultural change so that we don't glorify, reaching for a gun or have stupid laws like stand your ground, which basically entitles people to shoot when they could retreat and ends up in more bloodshed. B.D. Dimmitt, France is now looking to massively upsize its military, if only to produce the wherewithal to boost Ukraine's struggle. That is probably inevitable. As a more broadly based policy indicator, it is worrisome. Is Europe generally moving toward a more US-like priorities? Well, there are two things going on here. One is to give Ukraine what it needs, but also in France and Macron, the current leader, have been advocating is for a more independent European foreign and military policy so that they are not so dependent on the United States. And Russia's invasion of Ukraine kind of put that by the side, and NATO's more united now. But underneath, there are converging interests between, the U.S. and the European Union countries. One of U.S. foreign policy objectives has been to make sure that Germany and Russia don't form a political and economic bloc, which would, make the U.S. weaker by comparison. And that goes back to the end of World War II. So anyway, I think there are two things at work here. One is that independent EU military and foreign policy posture. That's underlying the immediate concern is Ukraine. And, it is concerning. And, what I've been advocating, I advocated in the campaign, is that we need to advocate and urge the U.S. to engage in diplomacy with Russia and the NATO countries for a pan-European security arrangement, like the common European home that Gorbachev called for after they, agreed to those nuclear arms control agreements, him and Reagan, so that Russia was included within a security framework, and it wasn't just NATO versus Russia. And I think we need to keep advocating that so that everybody feels secure And then we can have progressive conventional as well as nuclear disarmament. And, stop all this waste of resources going into the militaries when we need that. As David Schwartzman, who we had on the podcast at the beginning of the year to talk about, the climate issue and the Green New Deal, he said, we've got to defeat militarized fossil capital because that's what's driving the climate crisis. The military is enormously wasteful. It backs up fossil capital as it extracts and markets, processes, and then markets the fossil fuels. So, that's where the resources, not just the material resources, but the technical know-how of scientists and engineers, instead of working on weapons, they could be working on renewable energy. So, I do say we should provide arms to Ukraine for its self-defense, but that's a rounding error in the federal budget. And the biggest discretionary expenditure is the military, and that should be radically cut. And speaking about BDS, as I did before, right away, you're talking about $3 or $4 billion Israel gets every year in military aid. Why the hell are we giving it to them when they are totally violating international law by taking Palestinian land and denying the Palestinians their human and political rights? So there's $4 billion right there. There's the money in the pipeline. It's like $127 billion in arms sales. This is not the budget, but sales to Saudi Arabia, which has been engaged in this bloody war in Yemen. And who knows what else they want to use those weapons for. 37 military bases in Africa. And then the U.S. wonders why, given the history of the United States in Africa and, the colonial British America with slavery, and then not supporting a lot of liberation movements, particularly in Southern Africa against the white rules and white rule in, the Portuguese colonies, and then Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, and South Africa and Namibia. And we got military there when, the Chinese are building relationships with economic investments. They do have strings attached. That's a whole nother question. So, yeah, we got to demilitarize our foreign policy, really promote democracy. The U.S. is not credible when it says we're for democracy in Ukraine, but then we let Israel occupy Palestinian land and deny Palestinians their democratic rights. When we do military exercises with Morocco, who is occupying the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic to the south, and recognizes Morocco's annexation of that former Spanish colony. Pretty much alone in the world, only a few other countries do that. So we're against Russian-occupied territory in Ukraine, but we're for Israeli-occupied territory in Palestine and Moroccan-occupied territory in Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. So the hypocrisy's got to stop, or you don't have a democratic foreign policy. You got a hypocritical foreign policy. B.D. Dimmitt, Israel's opaque nuclear program makes any military aid from the U.S. illegal already, doesn't it? I don't know about the legalities, although, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Act and I would think other things mean that we don't give military aid to countries that are hiding their nuclear program. Everybody knows Israel's got about 100 nukes. Israel's never admitted it, but everybody else knows it. It's just common knowledge. I don't know about the legalities, but what we really should be doing is, first of all, going to Russia and saying, look, you were concerned about security and NATO. Let's talk. Let's get back on the nuclear treaties that were unilaterally withdrawn from by the United States, the Anti-Ballistic Missiles Treaty by the Bush administration, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty by the Trump administration, the Open Skies Treaty, which allowed, for observing each other's military forces, so nobody could do anything sneaky. That was the Trump administration, and the Biden administration says we're not going to try to reopen it. Russia, for its part, pulled out of the Conventional Forces Treaty for Europe in 2007. Their excuse was, well, NATO's got more troops than we do, so we don't want to abide by this agreement. And so these things have fallen by the wayside. And then Putin's saying, well, we're at war with the West. And we should say, we don't want a war with you. We want a mutual security agreement and move toward nuclear disarmament. So that's with Russia. And then we should also be pursuing this treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which now over 100 countries have signed, and it's been ratified by over 50. And what it does is say nuclear weapons are illegal, and you should begin a process of disarming. And of course, that's not going to happen unless it's mutual. So the U.S. should be approaching all the nuclear powers, in my opinion, and saying, okay, we're going to take some initiatives. We're going to pledge no first use of nuclear weapons. We're going to scrap our intercontinental ballistic missiles, which don't add to our deterrence but make us a target. We don't need them. We don't need as many nukes as we got as a deterrent. So we're going to reduce our nuclear force. So we're moving in that direction. Now we want to talk seriously with all of y'all about getting to zero nuclear weapons worldwide. I think that ought to be, a leading policy of the United States. And, basically by public shaming and public diplomacy and the support of other countries that have signed this treaty, put the pressure on Russia, Israel, Pakistan, India, North Korea. I said Israel. I think I left one country out. In any case, all the nuclear powers get to the table and work out mutual disarmament so that nuclear weapons are not the threat that they are, even without, a hot war. But when there are tensions, the likelihood of a mistake or misunderstanding leading to a nuclear launch is, unconscionably high. And we're lucky to still be here. There have been many close calls in the nuclear era, and we need to move fast if we're going to continue. So, but as the legality of U.S. giving military aid to Israel, I don't know. But I would think the disarmament movement would have got some lawyers to sue if it was illegal. But, I don't know for sure. B.D. Dimmitt. Okay, there's a Nation article there. I don't know if I can copy it off of there, but it was in the chat. Okay, I'll get that off the chat and read it and see what it says. You may be on to something I don't know about. Whoop, the hour has passed. I did want to comment. Marcia Everett was putting a whole bunch of things down there about electoral reforms that I think were, worth discussing. I won't discuss them long, but I saw the one, no more districts, Bill of Right for voting equality, yes. The one I wanted to just briefly comment, pay jurors equal to representatives. Yeah, let's pay public defenders equal to prosecutors. There's the one. No more districts, add more representatives, abolish the Senate. I think those are all worth considering. Districts, you could have, statewide or even nationwide proportional representation. Ukraine's next election will be pure proportional representation. The last one was half maybe more than half were from proportional representation. The other half were from single member districts, or maybe a third, somewhere in there. The next one is, so they have nationwide lists. Each party puts their list of candidates. The percentage each party gets determines how many of those candidates on their list are seated in the parliament. Or you could do the same idea within states, even as long as you have multi-member districts. There's a bill in Congress called the Fair Representation Act. It needs more sponsors. It only has about 9. Where the hell are the progressives on that? I wrote an article in Ralph Nader's Capitol Hill Citizen on that, calling out AOC and Ilhan Omar, who is elected from a city that uses ranked choice voting, including proportional ranked choice voting for their boards. So I think that's something we need more representatives. Yeah, you mean one? What is it now? One representative for about every 700,000 people? That's too distant. So we need more representatives. Um, and then abolish the Senate. Yeah, I wrote an article about that for Roll Call, another Capitol Hill publication, back in the year 2000. I've been for that for a long time. The problem is it would take a constitutional amendment and the unanimous agreement of the senators. So you're just not going to get senators, these Republican senators from states like Wyoming to agree to it. The other alternative is to have a constitutional convention. And maybe at some point when the delegates are elected by a proportional system and the politics seem right, we could move in that direction, abolish the Senate. Because right now it's the most undemocratic legislature in the modern world. The disproportionate number of people represented between Wyoming and California is just off the charts. So anyway, I think those are topics that we need to have more discussion and more campaigning to get a multi-party inclusive democracy. So the only thing I'll say in conclusion is, I don't know if it's been posted yet, I'm having a discussion with Jill Stein, hosted by the Alameda and California Green parties, on Ukraine tomorrow. It's at 8 o'clock Eastern time and 5 o'clock Pacific time. And if we can get that, there it is in the chat. So you need to register ahead of time. So copy that link if you want to attend. I did get confirmation today that they will post it online, although it may take a little while. So if you can't make it at 8 o'clock Eastern or 5 o'clock Pacific, it's scheduled to go 90 minutes. I suspect it may go a little longer. But anyway, that is going to be an interesting discussion, and I hope some of you will take it in. And with that, we will see you next week. And in the meantime, have a good week and keep on fighting.